So thank you so much for having me today. It's really an absolute pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about the angles around AI for good and other adjacent technologies such as blockchain and distributed ledger technologies when it comes to one of the most hotly debated topics, which is climate change. And over the next 15 minutes, I want to give you a bit of an approach and understanding of how blockchain and AI can actually be very helpful in addressing some of the big challenges that we have around meeting the Paris Agreement guidelines and principles and commitments that we have set out for each other. There's three fundamental things that blockchain together with AI can really help us address when it comes to the needs of the Paris Agreement. One is around transparency, two, decentralization, and three, the issue of trust. So blockchain, of course, has this big benefit that it records data immutably on a permanent ledger, increasing transparency and security. That is one thing that is highly important for us, because when you come to registering carbon flows of monetary flows and CO2 emissions, allowing trusted network carbon markets to address the inherently decentralized nature of different countries that operate under the Paris Agreement is a really, really important issue. And we've been struggling actually connecting these decentralized networks more systematically and without issues of double counting, which I will get to later. Of course, the other one is peer-to-peer. So it's quite important where regulation and governance structures are very weak or otherwise unstable. Having a system where this peer-to-peer network is transparent and immutable, and it's publicly registered on a permission-based or permissionless network is really a very important aspect around DLT. Because once you connect blockchain with other digital technologies such as big data, AI, or different types of data collection methods, such as IoTs and drones and the others, it provides a much, much more accurate way to measure, report, and verify climate outcomes at significantly lower transaction costs. And this is really at the heart of what we need to address when it comes to ensuring that countries who commit to doing certain reductions of CO2 emissions are actually also following through. And lastly, it's the issue around smart contracts. So how can automation increase the efficiency and reduce the transaction costs and the frictions within the system? It's quite important when you start talking about decentralized carbon markets, because individual consumers are empowered to produce, store, and trade their own renewable energy produced, for example, with neighbors or associated markets or cross-country markets, if you know that there are reliable, automated smart contract systems that enforce accordingly to the rules and regulations of the Paris Agreement, the flow of carbon finance and also of CO2 calculations and regulations. So one way of thinking about it is, as I said, climate action occurs very much in the real world. However, climate accounting is much more recorded in the digital world. And you can see on this slide, quite simply put out, that the actors are slightly different. On the climate action side, the real world, we have the polluters, we have the consumers, the ones that are working in climate finance, and the industrial stakeholders. So anything from your power plants to your banks, to your insurance companies, these are all real actors, including ourselves in the real world, releasing CO2 emissions on a daily basis, and really are part of the system where the action actually occurs. However, when it comes to the accounting globally, there are a lot more decentralized, fragmented markets that come into place. So there are national registries, local domains, certifications which are not nationally and internationally aligned, and the concept of having digital records where the alignment of flows is harmonized and also in line with regulations, not only national, but also globally, is something where there is still a lot of friction in the system, but it also is costing us a lot of time and transaction costs. And ultimately, if we want to reach the carbon agreements and stay under a 2-degree world, those are the angles where we really have to make use of all these disruptive technologies to be able to use it for good and use it to make headways when it comes to reaching climate agreements. One really big problem is this issue of double counting. If you imagine, a reforestation project in Africa, for example, a reforestation project is a project that is very intangible in nature when it comes to carbon assets. So when I'm talking about carbon assets, I mean the emissions allowances and offsets units that enable us to differentiate between the ownership of the investment and the right to trade those emissions. So while the investment of the reforestation project is in sub-Saharan Africa, the right to trade the emissions can be given essentially to different markets to be traded. However, the question is, how can we make sure that those investments are traced accordingly to and directly linked to these carbon assets? How can we make sure that there are not different markets accounting for that same reforestation project year after year, and we fall into the trap of double counting, which is one of the big problems that we've had a lot with the issues around carbon offsettings that many aviation companies have been using in order to offset some of their CO2 emissions. But there has been a lot of negativity around this and a lot of issues, rightfully so, because inherently, we're not actually ensuring that the polluter changes the way that they operate to become more renewable. But on the other side, there have been quite a few problematic issues of double counting. And we see that things have been accounted for multiple times. And this is where new technologies, DLT, together with AI, actually can have a real substantial impact when it comes to changing the concept. When it comes, as I said, to the data transaction itself, it is much more about how to tokenize these units that brings in more liquidity into the carbon markets and allows more capabilities. One that is quite important, as I mentioned, is this increased interoperability. So it is not actually that easy to look at the European trading system for climate credits and then think that you can trade between different platforms as easily as you would think. And this is very true for cross-border transactions between different systems and different schemes. One of the example one is Corsia, that is used very regularly in the international aviation system, as I mentioned. And this is where the use of AI and blockchain together can have a very dramatic improvement effect, actually, in ensuring that there's much more of a liquid cross-border market between those two systems. Let me give you two examples of what I'm talking about when I'm saying all about these use of AI and blockchain for climate actions. One of the example is an external example outside to EBRD, the first one, which is a quite interesting one between a renewable energy small microgrid company called Bbox, which is operating in Rwanda, and IBM. So Rwanda's Bbox company and IBM collaborated together to set up a system for remote deployment and tokenization of carbon offsets. One of the things that was Bbox was pushing for in this pilot very strongly was that how can we, in a country that is quite rural in its IT infrastructure, such as Rwanda, incentivize the individual households to switch from diesel-based energy generation in their homes onto installing solar PV panels on their roofs. What would be the benefit for them to do this switch? And how can we ensure that they get a share as the user as part of the savings from carbon emissions by making this switch? The only way that this was actually really feasible at that level and also remotely was to say that for every solar PV installation onto the household roofs, it was connected to a smart grid and it was connected to a smart meter. And the readings from the smart meter were recorded on a blockchain distributed ledger system. That distributed ledger system that was set up by IBM allowed that the readings of the smart meter were recorded, digitalized, there was an assurance that there was no tampering with the actual flow of the energy that was generated. So no one was actually getting compensated for solar PV energy that they generated, but actually they had still their diesel generator. To do those things, it was very important to have the according AI algorithms in place. But then much more importantly is, once we have this generated solar PV energy, how can we tokenize the carbon offsets that we have now recorded? And how can we further monetize them as part of the larger carbon markets? How is it able to generate small scale at the microgrid level renewable energy, but how is it able to record those, ensure that they're verified, that they're transferable, but also sell them in different markets? And this is one of the carbon offset blockchain pilots, which actually received one of the biggest standards, the gold standard, by one of the largest verification bodies that exist. So it's quite an interesting one, how you can think about small scale solutions being tapped into larger markets with the use of blockchain and AI. The same we've been doing at the EBRD, and it's an ongoing pilot that we're doing now. And it's a lot around energy efficiency credit lines. So us as a private sector institution, we do public and private sector deals. We're also very much committed to making energy efficiency credit lines and loans to sub-borrowers, so either SMEs or either residential energy efficiency borrowers who would like to replace their residential energy generation system with a renewable energy generation system. And as part of this pilot, what we're working in very closely in is trying to figure out how can we ensure that the blockchain and the generated AI algorithms that are associated with the system can automate the calculations of the carbon credits and automatically also ensure that the grant sections that is passed on to the sub-borrowers who are interested to replace their residential energy generation to renewable energy generation will be remunerated accordingly to the amount of CO2 savings that I have saved, that was tokenized, and then ultimately we have been able to use that and also monetize it as part of larger national carbon markets. And I think this is where we see that there is an immense amount of potential actually to tie much more smaller scale projects that we can see every day, you know, whether they're in sub-Saharan Africa or even when it is in the UK markets, opportunities to use these new types of disruptive technology, which really only work in tandem. As Nigel was said, we're not talking anymore about the silos of technologies, but much more putting them together and thinking about how can I use a smart meter to do better recording of data? How can I ensure that data is better used in making better decision making, in making more transparent decisions? And how can I make sure that the final user of that technology, the one that is willing to replace their residential households with renewable energy, will be monetized and remunerated for the savings of CO2 that have been linked to currently much more fragmented carbon markets. I see that I'm running out of time, so I will stop here, but I'm more than happy to take more questions during the Q&A about the work we're doing on blockchain and AI, and in particular when it comes to carbon markets. Thank you.